I'm Evan Smith, the CEO of the Texas Tribune. On behalf of my colleagues at the Trib, I want to welcome you to this year's Texas Tribune Festival. Every one of our 11 years in business, the work of our nonprofit newsroom has been critically important, but never more than in 2020. We produce reliable, credible reporting on issues that affect everyday Texans, making them better informed and motivating them to participate civically. You and people like you, readers, donors, attendees at our events, make that possible. This month, as part of our fall drive, we're hoping to sign up 500 new members. Go to texastribune.org/give and support our efforts to create more thoughtful citizens through public service journalism. Now on with the show. I hope you enjoy this conversation between Vanita Gupta, President and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, and New York Times reporter Katie Benner.
I'm Katie Benner, a Justice Department reporter at the New York Times, and on behalf of the Texas Tribune, I'm very excited to welcome you all to the 2020 Texas Tribune Festival, and to thank you for tuning into my conversation with Vanita Gupta, one of the nation's most prominent civil rights lawyers. Vanita is currently the head of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, which she joined after serving as the head of the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division during the Obama administration. While at the department, she worked to advance criminal justice reform and hold police departments to account when they violated the constitutional rights of citizens in their communities. And that included police departments in Ferguson, Cleveland, Baltimore, and Chicago. Vanita was also the director of the Center for Justice at the American Civil Liberties Union. And early in her career, she worked to overturn the convictions and fight for the release of dozens of Black Americans who had been wrongfully convicted by all-white juries in Texas. We're very lucky to spend the next 30 minutes with Vanita to talk about today's big issues around the use of federal forces to police our streets and the Trump administration's work to control the right to vote and the impact of the census on future elections. So Vanita, thank you so much for being here.
It's great to be here with you, Katie. Thank you. And thanks to everyone for tuning in for the Texas Tribune Festival.
Great. You know, Vanita, I'd like to just jump right in because we have fairly limited time and talk about the issue that's probably top of mind for everybody, which is the election. Currently, we've seen Postmaster General DeJoy testify before Congress. He has reversed some of the policies that he implemented that slowed mail service, but many offices are still understaffed. They've lost vital equipment that they need to use to sort and deliver the mail. And this has obvious implications for our right to vote in the middle of a pandemic, to vote by mail. But I was wondering if you could talk about how these actions and the actions of the administration around the post office really disempowers communities of color. You know, could you make that link for us between the mail service and what's going on with race in America and the right to vote for people who are not white?
Sure. So, you know, the history of voting and voting access in this country from the founding of our country is laced with racial exclusion and the fight to expand the right to vote for all people. And voters of color have always borne the brunt of these voter suppression efforts. People sometimes think that voter suppression is like in the black and white photos from the civil rights era, but actually, because racism is ever shape-shifting, the kinds of methods that people use to suppress the vote are also ever shape-shifting. And in this election, I think we are seeing unprecedented challenges. Long before COVID, we understood, those of us that are voting rights advocates, that we would need to be ready to battle, you know, disinformation campaigns, racialized misinformation campaigns, especially after the experience of the 2016 election. But COVID has really made that even more challenging. And the weaponization of COVID in this moment to stoke fear and to, you know, confuse voters is really has expanded the font of voter suppression fights that we're engaged in. So let me get a little more concrete. You know, in March, when COVID started to come to American towns and cities, states started to postpone their primaries from Louisiana through a series of other states, recognizing that voters and election officials were ill prepared to figure out how to conduct elections with this global pandemic. And so we saw, some states like Wisconsin, debacle of an election where polling places were closed in large urban dense areas. Voters were waiting in line. Voters of color in particular in those large urban areas were forced to wait in lines of 7 and 8 hours to cast their ballot, often with, little PPE for poll workers and the like. And right now, the primaries were really a wake-up call for getting prepared for the November election. There's been a very big shift to getting states to have vote by mail regimes because of the pandemic, but also to expand early in-person voting, extend online voter registration. But this move to expand voting by mail it's a necessity. People don't feel safe going to polling places. Our poll workers tend to be retirees, and so there's a big effort to recruit younger poll workers. But the reality is that voting by mail is going to be a crucial feature of our November election, and states are going to go from having voters like New York, 5% of voters voting by mail, potentially to having 60 or 70% of their voters voting by mail. But the president has pretty systematically in the last several months been attacking this legitimate form of voting. And we believe, a lot of us believe it's really to sow the seeds for delegitimizing what could be otherwise a valid election come November. And those who are going to bear the brunt of this kind of confusion about rules, confusion about how to vote. There's a lot of rules changing in the states about how to vote in November. Voters of color will most likely bear the brunt of it. Absentee ballots historically have been rejected at higher numbers for voters of color. There are signature mismatching laws. The attack on the U.S. Postal Service is now the latest front of this, where there's long been an agenda to privatize the U.S. Postal Service, but the president himself a couple of weeks ago, connected the undermining and cuts to the U.S. Postal Service to his desire to cut back on absentee and mail-in voting. And this is a real problem. It can discourage voters. And so there's a massive effort right now to make sure that people understand that absentee voting, mail-in voting is the same thing, is safe, it's secure, that most states have this regime in place, and to make sure that voters are empowered to know how to show up and how to vote, even with all of these battles that we're fighting to protect the U.S. Postal Service, to protect mail-in voting and the like.
Sure. One of the interesting things about what's going on with the Postal Service, we saw DeJoy testify. We are listening to people like you talk about how important it is to be able to vote by mail. But the striking thing is that it seems that there is no mechanism for actually reining in the president's behavior. There's no way to stop the president from attacking his own administration, whether that's the Postal Service, whether that is parts of the Justice Department, the FBI. He is really empowered to do this with no other mechanism to rein him in other than, the legislative branch, which doesn't seem interested in this moment in saying that this is behavior that needs to be curbed. So it's interesting to see how much of a functioning government is a norm, is not a law, is not written in stone. So how has the Trump administration, I think more generally, used this situation to its advantage? And what happens after the election, whether he wins again in 2020 or whether he doesn't and he leaves in 2024? I think we've learned a big lesson about just how much power the president really has. So one, how has the Trump administration used this power and sort of realized something that other presidents didn't or was willing to go places other presidents weren't willing to go? And then two, what do we do about that in the future?
So there's a lot packed into that question. I mean, I'm going to question the premise a little bit, which is that there are checks in our system of democracy on presidential power. There is no question that this president in particular has tested the bounds of this, and we're seeing a lot of silence from the legislative branch that I want to talk about. But, there's been a lot of litigation, for instance. The courts have been a check in a number of instances on some of the most egregious excesses of the president. We are a nation fundamentally of both laws and norms. And there have been a number of times where the president's power to engage in certain actions or engage certain policies has actually been stopped and circumscribed. I think what has been really eye-opening for those of us who have been doing civil rights advocacy. And mind you, I do this work nonpartisan, but my organization at the Leadership Conference is nonpartisan. But we have to call out abuses of power and civil rights abuses where we find them. And it has been shocking and staggering the degree to which, frankly, Republican members of Congress have been largely silent through some of these egregious excesses. We are supposed to have checks and balances. And the Republican Senate in particular has really been kind of uniformly disciplined about staying quiet and not criticizing the president, not performing their role of checks and balances. I mean, the 2018 midterm elections were so significant because it finally brought in a different party into Congress. And you saw the House really engage that power in the last Congress to provide some of those checks and balances. But the media has been an incredibly important force too for the last several years in providing those checks and balances. There's been a lot of people power. It's been hard, but I remember when news first broke out about the president engaging the policy of breaking families up and detaining children, separating children from their parents in immigration detention facilities all over the border. And at that moment, it really felt like there was litigation. The ACLU and other organizations were litigating this issue. There was largely too much silence from Congress. The media was lifting this issue up, but that was a moment where it really mattered to have tens of thousands of people in cities around the country, come together in June, kind of decrying the moral outrage of this horrific and inhumane practice. And so I think we are absolutely dealing with some of the gravest threats on our democracy right now in this administration. I mean, just looking at the RNC convention and the violations of the Hatch Act, which nobody really cares about outside of Washington, D.C., but holding campaigning events at the White House. These are violations of norms, but they're violations of the law. And I think the danger is if we normalize this, and it's the normalization of some of these grave violations, and rhetoric, and also the normalization of what we as a country will deem acceptable from our elected officials. I think the racism and the blatant kind of weaponization of white supremacy has been really dangerous. It worries me about our children, my children, growing up in an environment where things that I don't want them to hear are coming out of the mouths of some of the highest officials of the land. And so I think this has been a real challenge. When you've been reporting on the Justice Department, I worked at the Justice Department. It has been heartbreaking over the last several years to see some of the most basic norms of having a separation between the Justice Department and the White House, not allowing the president to call for vindictive prosecution of his opponents or political enemies. These norms have been broken. The attacks on federal judges based on ethnicity or for coming out with decisions that the president doesn't agree with. I mean, these things have been happening on our watch. And sometimes I think, wow, it's been the boiling of the frog where it's all happening as we're speaking. And we think, no, this can't happen in the United States of America. But we also, we are watching all of this, and we've had an attorney general now with Attorney General Barr, who has been more than willing to really be much more the president's lawyer than the lawyer representing the United States of America. And so the rebuild, as you said, Katie, I think is going to be, it's going to be much more involved than just restating a bunch of policies that were withdrawn or issuing new ones. I think this is going to require some pretty significant reckoning, cultural reckoning with our democratic norms. It may require even, holding people accountable for these violations, so people actually, understand that some of what's been happening is absolutely not normal and shouldn't be deemed acceptable in a thriving democracy.
And when you say holding people accountable, do you have people or positions in mind? What would that look like?
There's anything from, there could be the potential, and this is making a lot of assumptions. I mean, who knows what happens in November? That outcome remains to be determined. But if there's a different administration, one could imagine that a new Justice Department is going to be looking backwards and doing a lot of investigations of various things that have happened, the relationships with Ukraine and Russia, why Roger Stone and Flynn's cases were kind of changed course in the middle of the prosecutions. I mean, there's any number of topics that I think could result in both criminal investigations and prosecutions, truth and reconciliation commissions, things that really force the nation to reckon with what has been happening, and also would reveal more of what has been happening, since there may be a lot that the American public doesn't even know. And so, I think that, this is just purely at the kind of federal Justice Department. My guess is that voters, are going to come out in November, partly driven by their views on where they fall along these lines and how they view, whether the actions of this administration are lawless, whether they are normal, whether they want to see them perpetuated or not.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And, I think that when we look at this election, we're dealing with very present issues like USPS, but going to future elections, they will be impacted greatly by the census that's being undertaken right now. A census that's going to wrap up earlier than I think is normal, which is a move that people have criticized and people have said, a move that has fueled fears that the administration is trying to use something as straightforward as the census in order to curb the voices of people who are not white in this country. Could you explain just a little bit about how that works? And could you explain a little bit about what makes this census so different and so unusual from past?
Yeah, so, like the U.S. Postal Service, which I think has rightfully gotten the attention it has, the U.S. Census has been actually under attack for the last couple of years as well. And the U.S. Census, what is it? It's an operation that takes place once every 10 years, mandated by the U.S. Constitution for the federal government to count every single person in our nation's borders, regardless of status, background, and the like. And this year, the 2020 census coincides with a presidential election. It's not usually the case, but the census is the basis for the apportionment of districts to the U.S. House of Representatives. It's also the basis for how states carve their districts for the next 10 years. It's also the basis for how over $1 trillion+ gets allocated to every district in Congress for things like schools, healthcare, roads, infrastructure, hospitals. And so there's a lot riding on this census. And the census really is the story of who we are and the changing story of America throughout decades. And this go around, those of you will remember that the Trump administration sought to add a citizenship question to the U.S. Census. This was an unprecedented act. Never before has the census, the decennial census, asked for citizenship status information. The Justice Department enforces the Voting Rights Act and a slew of civil rights laws. The Trump administration was saying they need this data on citizenship to enforce the Voting Rights Act. Those of us who knew then Attorney General Jeff Sessions and could see right through this rationale, and litigation ultimately prevailed. The United States Supreme Court made the determination that the citizenship question could not lawfully be on the 2020 census after a lot of effort. But it scared people because there's a lot of mistrust about the federal government and this administration's motives. And so the Leadership Conference runs a national NGO effort to get the count out. It's called censuscounts.org. And we were confronting and working with local and state immigrants' rights organizations, racial justice organizations, trying to figure out how can we instill confidence in people. There are robust federal protections that keep this data confidential. The government can't use this data for enforcement purposes, but to instill confidence to fill out the census, given how much is at stake for all of our communities. And then just several weeks ago, COVID hit the census pretty hard. It's a massive $18 billion already spent on trying to get out the count. The Census Bureau spends years preparing for the count period, but COVID hit right as the field operations were set to start. And it delayed a lot of the outreach efforts. And so right now, as of yesterday, I think 74% of households have been counted in the census. We've never gotten to 100%, but we've gotten close to 100% in 2010, the closest we've ever gotten. And the Bureau usually has ways to impute the gap and fill the gap through other administrative records and the like. But 74% is historically the lowest it's ever been at this time period for any census. And the Trump administration just a few weeks ago decided to cut the period during which people can be counted even further. So the Bureau had said, we need to extend the count through October to October 31st to be able to make up the difference because of COVID. And the Trump administration said, no, we're going to cut it to September 30th. I don't think this is getting nearly the attention it needs. The hardest to count communities are the most vulnerable. They are the ones who require the door-to-door outreach in order to fill out the census. Sometimes it's because, the census isn't culturally a part of their environment. They need to understand why they would fill it out. They need language assistance. They, for whatever reasons. And cutting short the census now could have dramatic ramifications for a systematic undercount of communities of color that could therefore, the results of which would last a decade in terms of political power, in terms of economic resources in their communities. And one of the biggest, the kind of longest standing agendas for the administration has been to try to take out undocumented communities from a political apportionment to the U.S. House of Representatives, to change the kind of denominator or base that is used to count people for apportionment purposes. And the reality is that would be pretty devastating because our Constitution requires that we do this count, that mayors don't have the choice to determine whether policing or fire services are going to go to somebody because they're a documented immigrant or a U.S. citizen versus not. And so to have these kinds of monies and political representation, not be reflective of everyone who is in a person's community is really dangerous. But these are some of the challenges that we're confronting. And I think are really of a piece they're tied to the cuts and the attacks on the U.S. Postal Service and the attacks on our democracy. This is really an effort to attack kind of basic infrastructure that is required for an inclusive democracy that is the United States, that is a project that we have been working on since the founding of this country. And these are some of the big challenges that we're facing right now.
I think there's been a level of consciousness around institutional racism in the United States that we haven't seen for decades, sparked in large part by the killing of George Floyd. The Justice Department is currently investigating that shooting for civil rights violations. I'm wondering if you can explain to Texas Tribune viewers what that case might look like. What would the argument for charges against the officer who shot George Floyd look like?
Well, so there's a local investigation and a federal investigation. There are all kinds of factors that would make this, I think, a chargeable case, namely that even with the highest standard that is required, the highest criminal intent standard that the Justice Department has to prove to make out one of these cases, the intentionality depicted by Derek Chauvin having his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck literally for 8 minutes and 44 seconds. The intentionality, I think, really goes to everything you had the police chief and the mayor say this was not how officers were trained. So the training actually also matters. This is a case to me that is not a hard case for prosecutors. But I will say, I think what is really significant about George Floyd's murder and the aftermath is that it really has triggered a broader cultural reckoning, even beyond policing. Obviously, a reckoning around systemic racism in policing, but also when you have NASCAR kind of make the changes that it was making, corporate America being forced to investigate its own practices in different companies. I mean, this has had a ripple effect far beyond what happened in Minneapolis that day. And those protests were have been multiracial, multi-generational, this real kind of understanding of how the dehumanization of Black people, the dehumanization of communities of color, the systematic disinvestment in communities of color has brought us to that type of incident, and the look of impunity on Derek Chauvin's face being, unforgettable. I think that this is a really important moment that, while the protests may have, dissipated somewhat, there's still protests going on today, but I think this cultural reckoning is going to stay with us for a while. And I hope it does, because I think for too long, we tend to brush these issues under the carpet and just wait for the next critical incident. I don't think there's a return to normal. I think we now have to kind of really think about forging a new path forward, and the greater understanding in homes across America of what systemic racism is, what it looks like, how it has shaped this country and our policies and institutions, I think is a really important but difficult conversation. And hopefully is yielding action from local officials straight through Congress. There's a lot more that needs to happen, but I think this cultural reckoning is incredibly, incredibly important.
We only have a few minutes left, but I wanted to note that what you said about the George Floyd case and the cultural reckoning that's happening, I think is certainly true. It's been 3 months since George Floyd was killed. We've not seen the Justice Department make give any hints that it's about to announce its findings in that investigation. We've seen the Justice Department decide to not prosecute Officer Pantaleo, the officer in the Eric Garner case, another murder of a Black person that was caught on video where he was choked to death. To your point that there was a huge cultural reckoning happening and a big conversation that's going to change the country, it doesn't seem like the federal government wants to be a part of that conversation, that it wants to absent itself from that conversation, or it doesn't want to be a proactive part of the conversation. We've seen this certainly at the Justice Department. So I'm wondering, what does that mean for another 4 years of Trump if you have an administration that seems to be either absent from or not in step with what is happening in a larger way in the church?
Well, I think this is beyond just being absent from. I mean, I think the administration at every turn has actually used racism as an electoral tactic, as a organizing tactic. And I think that this election really truly is a question of saving the soul of our democracy and defining who we are. This is a moment that calls on everyone to really ask themselves what kind of country we want to be. The role of the federal government is one thing. And I think, Congress, I testified next to George Floyd's brother in the House for the Justice and Policing Act. It's stalled again in the Senate, where it's not even getting a hearing, along with legions of other civil rights bills that are in Mitch McConnell's graveyard. And so it isn't just about the president. It's about who we want as senators. It's about who we want as district attorneys in our local communities. This is a choice for voters come November to take part and to help define our country. And there's a lot of ways in which we can feel overwhelmed by the problems or overwhelmed by the attacks and say, well, maybe it won't even matter because the system is so rigged. If I have one message for people who are listening, it really is to see yourself as an agent of power. Register now. Go to vote.org, get your absentee ballot, figure out how you're going to fill it out and how your state allows you to receive it. Fill out the census. If you're going to vote in person, do this early, vote early, but don't be on the sidelines right now and just be a witness and commentator about the decline of our country. We all have a role to play in helping to define our future. It is one of the things that has always made the American project so meaningful and valuable. But if we sit it out, then we truly are giving up. And I think what has been so encouraging to me about this moment is I actually feel really hopeful that, and I'm watching the activism and the sense of kind of purpose and duty that so many Americans are showing in this moment. But it is going to be up to all of us to fight for our democracy and for our country. And it isn't there's nothing that we can take for granted in terms of, we're a pretty young country. Democracy is kind of an experiment. And so we've got some choices to make and some action to take.
Great. Vanita, thank you so much for being here today. It was a great conversation. I hope that everybody enjoyed it, and I'm so glad to be able to speak with you.
Thank you so much, Katie.